In this lecture, I will focus on how we can go about evaluating the effectiveness, appropriateness, and quality of selection tools, where selection tools are sometimes referred to as selection assessments, selection tests, selection procedures, as well as selection inventories. Now, selection tools are all used to help us determine which applicants are going to be likely to perform best on the job should they be hired. So first we'll start with an overview of how we go about evaluating selection tools, and then we'll move on to specific ways in which we can evaluate the quality, appropriateness, and effectiveness of selection tools, which includes law and ethics, reliability, validity, and utility. So let's start with that overview. So first, the appropriateness, quality, and effectiveness of selection tools should be evaluated with the following in mind: law and ethics, reliability, validity, and utility. So let's start with law and ethics. And first, let's focus in on the law. So for each selection tool, it's important to ask the following question: does the selection tool discriminate against or adversely impact applicants from a protected group? Where protected groups or classes include things in the United States, groups such as, or categories such as race, religion, national origin, sex or gender, and so forth and so on. Now, in the United States, municipal, state, and federal employment laws should be followed, such as, but not limited to, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Now, the following are some useful resources for U.S. employers when it comes to making sure our selection tools adhere to prevailing legal guidelines. The first is the Uniform Guidelines in Employee Selection Procedures, and this was first published decades ago in 1978, but it still is a useful resource. And as you can see, the website is uniformguidelines.com, and if you go there, you can find this as a free resource. The next resource I'll point you towards for the U.S. employer is the American Psychological Association and the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology's Principles for the Validation and Use of Personnel Selection Procedures, which was just updated in 2018 as its 5th edition. In addition, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission website for the United States often has a number of useful resources for employees when it comes to not just selection tools, but other types of employment practices and how we can make sure as employers that we adhere to prevailing laws, especially at the federal level. And you can find that website at eeoc.gov. Now, let's switch gears from law and now focus on ethics. So beyond legal guidelines, laws, and court cases, organizations or employers should apply ethical decision-making when deciding on a selection tool and how it should be administered, if at all. So ethics guides how people should behave in different situations and under different conditions. And often it's good to pause and ask the following question: just because we can do something, should we do that thing? So ideally, to arrive at an ethical decision, decision makers should include or consult with key stakeholders such as employees, hiring managers, and HR professionals, and consult with those with different perspectives and experiences. And to learn more about ethical decision-making frameworks, I recommend checking out Brown University's Science and Technology Studies resource, and I provide the URL here in case you're interested. Now, let's switch gears from talking about law and ethics as a way that we can evaluate the appropriateness of our selection tool, and now focus on how we can evaluate our selection tools in terms of their reliability. So first, let's talk about and define what reliability means. Well, in general, reliability can be thought of as the extent to which a selection tool consistently or dependably measures something. So in other words, reliability has to do with the consistency of measurement. Now, conventionally, a selection tool demonstrates an acceptable level of reliability when a reliability estimate is about 0.70 or higher, where a value of 0.00 would indicate very low reliability, and a value of 1.00 or just 1 would indicate a very high level of reliability. So again, we're aiming for about 0.7 or higher, but ideally we want reliability estimates to be as close to 1 as possible. Now, I should also point out that there are different types of reliability, and we'll focus on 3 that are particularly relevant for selection tools, which include test-retest reliability, inter-rater reliability, and internal consistency reliability. And next we'll move through each of these one by one. So let's start with test-retest reliability. Now, we can define test-retest reliability as the extent to which a measurement is consistent over time. Okay, so for example, if we administer the same selection tool at 2 time points to the same group of applicants, the correlation between the applicant scores for both administrations of that selection tool can serve as an estimate of reliability. So let's work through a more concrete example here. So let's imagine here we have this table, where here in the first column we have applicants. Next column, we're going to have scores for the selection tool at time 1. Let's say this is week 1. And then we have that same selection tool administered at time 2. Let's say this is 3 weeks later, so this is week 4. Okay, so first, in terms of the applicants, let's imagine that these 6 or 7 people are the applicants. Okay, so this is our sample, or this is our group of applicants, in other words. Now let's imagine that we give this group of applicants the selection tool, they complete the selection tool, and these are their scores. So as you can see, Mohammed scored a score of 78, Tu had a score of 62, Shakari 99, and so forth and so on. Now let's see how they did at time 2. So this was 3 weeks later in this hypothetical example. So again, this is the same selection tool just administered at a second time point, hence the name test-retest reliability. And so as you can see here, Mohammed scored a score of 79 on the second administration, or at time 2, which is fairly close to the score Mohammed received at time 1 of 78. And you can see the rest of the applicants' scores here below in the time 2 column. Now, if we correlate the scores from time 1 with the scores of time 2 for this group of applicants, we would get a correlation of 0.99. Now, if you remember, the highest possible value for reliability is 1.00. So this is a very high level of test-retest reliability, and it is definitely greater than 0.70, which is that cutoff that we conventionally use for whether our reliability estimate would be considered acceptable or unacceptable for a particular selection tool. So in this case, this selection tool shows acceptable levels of test-retest reliability with this sample of applicants. Now let's focus on inter-rater reliability. Now, inter-rater reliability refers to the extent to which measurement is consistent between raters, hence the term inter or between rater reliability. So for example, if 2 trained raters evaluate the performance of the same group of applicants on the same selection tool, then the correlation between the 2 raters' scores on those 2 selection tools can serve as an estimate of reliability. And so just as we did before, let's focus on a more concrete example here. So now here we have a table that should look fairly familiar. The only thing I've changed here is that now instead of time 1 and time 2, which we use for test-retest reliability, now we're focusing on rater A and rater B, which are our 2 independent trained raters in this case. So let's see who our applicants are. Well, it's the same group as applicants before in our previous hypothetical example, and now let's see how they performed on the selection tool when rated by rater A. So rater A gave these applicants the following scores on this selection tool. You can imagine maybe it's a structured interview, and this rater is going through and scoring the applicants in terms of their overall performance. And we see Mohammed got a score of 91, Tu a score of 93, Shakari a score of 88. Now let's see how rater B rated this same group of applicants here. Well, rater B rated Mohammed as 82, Tu as 77, and Shakari as 94. Now let's take a look at the correlation between rater A's scores and rater B's scores for the same group of applicants using the same selection tool, which is going to be our test of inter-rater reliability. Well, the correlation is 0.53 in this case. Well, 0.53 is going to be less than 0.70, which again, if you recall, is our typical or conventional cutoff or threshold for determining whether or not a selection tool and its reliability is considered acceptable or unacceptable. So in this case, this means this selection tool shows unacceptable levels of inter-rater reliability. Internal consistency reliability can be a little bit more difficult to wrap our minds around. So let's first start with the definition, and then we'll work through a more concrete example. So first, I'm going to use the definition that was provided by Schultz and Whitney in their 2005 book, in which they defined internal consistency reliability as being, quote, a reliability estimate based on the intercorrelation or homogeneity among items on a test, with alpha being a prime example, end quote. So there's a couple important things about this definition. First, note that it is a reliability estimate based on the intercorrelation among items on a test, where in our case, we're focusing on a test as being a selection tool. And intercorrelation just simply means the different correlations between unique items or questions on a test, okay? And alpha refers to Chromebox alpha, which is something we'll return to a little bit later on. So let's think of an example here. So for example, if a selection tool consists of 4 items or questions and is administered to a group of applicants, Chromebox alpha can be computed for the scores on those 4 items and can serve as an estimate of reliability. So let's make this more concrete. So here's an actual 4-item measure that we can look at here. And it's what we can call a multi-item selection tool, meaning that there's more than one item or question as part of this selection tool. In other words, more than one item or question that's intended to tap into or assess a particular concept or construct of interest, where the concept or construct in this context would be likely a knowledge, skill, ability, or other characteristic. So this example is of an extroversion personality measure, and I provided 4 different items here, okay? And these items are 1, make friends easily. 2, I am skilled in handling social situations. Item 3, I am always prepared. And item 4, I feel comfortable around people. Now, these are all 4 real items taken from Goldberg et al. 2006 and from the IPIP inventory online. Now, let's imagine that applicants, they're self-reporting this, so they go through and read each one of these items or questions and they say, I make friends easily, and they indicate whether they strongly disagree or strongly agree or somewhere in between. If they put strongly disagree, that they'll get a score of 1. If they put strongly agree, meaning they strongly endorse this, they get a score of 5. If they put a score of 3, for example, let's say that means neither disagree nor agree, meaning they're kind of in the middle, okay? Now, this is our 4-item measure, and let's assume that these 4 items are intended to tap into or assess the concept or construct of extroversion, which is a personality dimension, because let's assume based on a job analysis that we determined that people having the human attribute of extroversion is important for this job. Maybe it's a sales job or customer service job where it's important to demonstrate being outgoing, socially dominant, and so forth and so on. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you here is a correlation matrix. So let's imagine that those applicants went through, they responded to those 4 items I just showed you for that extroversion measure, and then we took their scores on each one of those items and correlated them with all other unique items. Okay, so what we see here is a matrix, and what you can see is on the column headers, we have item 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then on the rows, we have items 1, 2, 3, and 4. For simplicity, I only show you the lower diagonal here because it would just be a mirror reflection here in the upper diagonal, okay? And you'll probably get the picture why in just a second. So first, this value here of 1.00 is the correlation between item 1 and item 1. Any variable or item correlated with itself is going to have a perfect positive correlation. So that's why we see in the off diagonal here that each item is perfectly correlated at 1.00 with itself. So item 2 is correlated perfectly with itself, item 3 is perfectly correlated with itself, and item 4 is perfectly correlated with itself. That doesn't provide us much unique information, so we're going to be focusing on the information or the correlations or intercorrelations presented in the lower diagonal here. Okay, so let's first focus on the correlation between item 1 and item 2. It's about 0.53. That's actually fairly decent. That's what we would typically consider in this HR context, in the context of selection tools. That is what we consider to be a large or strong correlation between scores on these 2 items. Okay, so that probably suggests some level of consistency that these items are measuring something in common, or more likely to be. Now let's go down to the correlation between item 1 and item 3. You can see this correlation here is 0.12, which we would typically consider to be small. And so this likely means that item 1 and item 3, whatever they're measuring, is probably not something super consistent. They might be measuring different things potentially. And then let's look at item 1 correlated with item 4. We see it's back up to 0.59, so this correlation would be considered strong or large as well. So that's fairly consistent. And then let's move over to the next column here and let's look at the correlation between item 2 and item 3. Well, it's 0.15. So just like the correlation between item 1 and item 3, it's a fairly small correlation there. So again, this would likely mean that there's something inconsistent about these two items. Now looking at the correlation between item 2 and item 4, the correlation is 0.53, which would be an example of another strong or large correlation. So again, they seem to be measuring probably something consistently at least. And then finally, the correlation between item 3 and item 4, that is another low correlation or small correlation of 0.11. And so what do we see in common here? Well, we can see there's something with item 3. Item 3 is not seemingly consistent or homogeneous with the other 3 items, which are 1, 2, and 3. In other words, item 3 does not correlate highly with items 1, 2, and 4, and this likely indicates that this selection tool shows lower internal consistency reliability than it potentially could because of this problematic item 3. It just seems to be measuring something different. So let's go back to that set of 4 items we saw at the beginning, and let's look at this through the new information we have in terms of the correlations here. Because really what Chromebox Alpha is, which I'm eventually going to reveal to you for these 4 items, is really about you can think of it as almost being like the average intercorrelation or correlations between all the unique items with each other for a particular measure or selection tool. So going back to this example of our 4-item or multi-item selection tool for extroversion as a personality measure, remember item 1 is I make friends easily, item 2 is I am skilled in handling social situations, item 3 is I'm always prepared, and item 4 is I feel comfortable around people. And if you take another look at this, these are all 4 supposed to be measuring extroversion, but you can see item 3 says I am always prepared. That doesn't necessarily sound like something that is necessarily a part of someone's level of extroversion. Extroversion, we typically think of the extent to which someone is socially dominant, they're outgoing, just like is indicated here in items 1, 2, and 3. They're good in social situations, they're comfortable around people. 1, 2, and 4. Item 3 seems to be more about conscientiousness. It seems to be tapping into or assessing a different personality dimension than extroversion, and this likely explains why item 3 does not play well or it's inconsistent with the other 3 items. So what this means is that item 3 is both conceptually inconsistent and empirically inconsistent with the other 3 items. And in fact, if we were to run or estimate Chromebox Alpha, which is a typical or common way of estimating internal consistency reliability, we would find that Chromebox Alpha is equal to 0.67 for all 4 items when they're included, which if you recall would be below that 0.70 threshold or cutoff that we use to determine whether or not a selection tool has acceptable or unacceptable levels of validity. So this would indicate an unacceptable level of internal consistency reliability because Chromebox Alpha is 0.67, which is less than 0.70. Now, if we were to drop that inconsistent item, item 3, which is our problematic item, our Chromebox Alpha would increase to 0.79, which would be above 0.0, and there would thereby indicate an acceptable level of internal consistency reliability. So hopefully this provided a little bit more information, a little bit better understanding about what I mean when I say internal consistency reliability. It's a difficult concept to wrap our minds around, and hopefully this example brought it to life a little bit more. So now let's shift from focusing on reliability to focusing on the validity of our selection tools as an indicator of the quality and the effectiveness of our selection tools. So in terms of validity, we can think of validity as being defined as the extent to which a selection tool measures what it is supposed to measure. Now, this is a very broad general definition of validity, but it really just points to this. Validity has to do with the accuracy of measurement, whereas reliability is about the consistency of measurement. So if you hear validity, think accuracy. If you hear reliability, think consistency of measurement. Now, there are different types of validity, just like there was different types of reliability, and we'll focus on three that are particularly relevant for selection tools, which include content validity, criterion-related validity, and construct validity. So let's first focus on content validity. Well, we can define content validity as the extent to which a selection tool representatively samples the content of the job domain. Typically, content validity is estimated using job analysis and subject matter expert judgment, where subject matter expert is often abbreviated in this context as SME. Now, you can imagine this blue circle here represents the conceptual job domain. Okay, so let's imagine through a job analysis, we determined that this conceptual job domain consists of all the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics or KSAOs that are required to do that job. In other words, the human attributes that are required to do that job, as well as the tasks, duties, and responsibilities or the work that is required as part of that job. Now, let's imagine then that these green circles are selection tool questions or items. So let's imagine we're trying to construct a selection tool that's, let's say, a multi-item test of some type of knowledge that would be required for a particular job. Maybe it's safety knowledge for a more hazardous work environment type of job. And so here you can see that this green circle here represents a single selection tool question or item. And what we're trying to do here is create different items that tap into unique aspects of this conceptual job domain until we reach a point of more or less saturation, or we've covered as much as we can. Now, content validity will increase as the selection tool questions or items cover more unique aspects of the conceptual job domain. So we want, conceptually speaking, we want there to be green circles covering the entire blue circle of the conceptual job domain, if you want to think about it like that. So in other words, we want to representatively sample from the job domain all the unique aspects of it when we're developing our selection tool question or item. And often we use subject matter experts such as current job incumbents or current employees, in other words, and their supervisors and maybe other experts who might know something about that job to help evaluate the extent to which a selection tool and its questions or items really seem to tap into all of those unique aspects of the conceptual job domain as previously defined by hopefully some recent, up-to-date, and rigorous job analysis. So now let's switch from content validity to criterion-related validity. Well, criterion-related validity, this refers to the extent to which scores on a selection tool are associated with scores on some criterion. Okay? Now, like content validity, criterion-related validity can be used to establish the extent to which a selection tool is job-related. So what are some examples of a criterion in this context? Well, you can think of a criterion in this context when we're going about trying to validate or estimate the criterion-related validity of a selection tool as being some outcome that's job-related. So classic examples of criterion of or criteria of selection tools include supervisor ratings of job performance. So this might be the performance evaluation or performance appraisal scores. Some kind of more objective productivity measure. So in certain types of work, it might make sense to track something like sales revenue generated or the number of widgets someone produces on the manufacturing floor within a given time period. It might include, too, for customer-facing positions, it might include customer satisfaction ratings or customer service ratings of some kind. It could also include more counterproductive outcomes such as absenteeism or tardiness. And also, we could focus on outcomes related to safety, for example, such as accidents. Or more positively, we could focus on safety performance or other types of safety behaviors that we can observe and rate of employees. So now let's talk about validity coefficients in the context of criterion-related validity and where they come from. Well, criterion-related validity can be estimated by computing the correlation between scores on a selection tool and scores on a criterion of interest. So in this context, the correlation coefficient can be referred to as a validity coefficient. And often, we abbreviate the correlation coefficient as a little r italicized, which you see here parenthetically. Okay, this is our validity coefficient. And so again, in this context, when we're looking at the criterion-related validity, the correlation between scores on the selection tool and scores on the criterion that correlation coefficient can be referred to as or thought of as a validity coefficient. So here's a quick review of correlation coefficients in this context so that we're on the same page about how to interpret them. Now, when we're thinking about a correlation coefficient, and in this case, I'm really thinking about a Pearson product moment correlation, possible values can range from -1 to 1. And a correlation of -1 would indicate a perfect inverse or negative association between two continuous variables. A correlation of 1.0, on the other hand, would indicate a perfect positive correlation between two continuous variables. And then finally, a correlation of 0 would indicate no association or no correlation between those two continuous variables. Now, we are going to be pretty excited in the context of criterion-related validity of selection tools when we see a correlation that starts getting above 0.2 or 0.3. If it gets to 0.5, even better. But because we're talking about human beings and trying to predict their future performance, we really don't expect to see a perfect positive correlation of 1, or for more counterproductive outcomes, a perfect negative correlation of 1. Again, absolute value of 0.2 or 0.3, that's if assuming that correlation coefficient is statistically significantly different from 0, we would get pretty excited about that in most cases in a selection context. Now, there's two types of criterion-related validity that are ways in which we can estimate criterion-related validity is another way of thinking it. And these are concurrent validity and predictive validity. So let's focus on concurrent validity first. So concurrent validity is the extent to which scores on a selection tool are associated with scores on a criterion when both the selection tool and the criterion measure are administered to current employees at about the same time. When we talk about current employees, another way of saying that is job incumbents. Now, so let's imagine it like this. We have our arrow of time here at the bottom. And with a concurrent validity estimate of criterion-related validity, we are going to administer the selection tool and the criterion measure at about the same time to current employees. So you can see here, they're measured or they're administered at about the same time, both the selection tool and our criterion measure. Where again, criterion measure could be, let's say, supervisor ratings of performance or customer satisfaction ratings, whatever would be relevant for the conceptual job domain and the performance domain specifically for whatever job it is that we're trying to estimate the criterion-related validity of this particular selection tool. So this is also called a concurrent validation design or study. So we can estimate concurrent validity using a concurrent validation design or study, which is what you see pictured here. Now, next, let's talk about the second type, or the second approach to estimating criterion-related validity, which is through predictive validity. And this refers to the extent to which scores on a selection tool are associated with scores on a criterion when the selection tool is administered to job applicants and the criterion measure is administered later on to those applicants who were hired or eventually hired as employees. So again, let's focus on this visually here. Here's our arrow of time. And let's imagine we have our pool of applicants. We administer our selection tool to that pool of applicants. They receive their scores on that selection tool. Time passes. Some of those applicants are eventually hired. And let's assume after some period of time, say 6 months of the applicants being on the job, we then measure a criterion of interest. So let's assume it's supervisor ratings of job performance or a performance evaluation. And we administered this to the people who are now employees but were previously applicants who completed the selection tool in question. So as you can see here, there is temporal or time separation between when we administer the selection tool and it's administered to job applicants, and there's separation then to when we then administer the criterion measure to those applicants who are later hired as employees. So this would be an example of what we call a predictive validation design or study, what you see pictured here. So now let's switch to the third type of validity we're going to talk about. We've previously talked about content validity, then we went on to talk about criterion-related validity. Let's talk about construct validity now. Construct validity refers to the extent to which a selection tool measures a particular concept or construct of interest. Okay? In other words, construct validity has to do with the degree to which we are confident that the selection tool assesses what we intended to assess. In other words, does it measure what we set out to measure? That's really what construct validity gets at. Okay? And construct in this case refers to what particular KSAO or knowledge, skill, ability, or other characteristic or task, duty, or responsibility are we trying to assess here? Okay? What is it we're trying to assess? That's the construct. And so we're talking about construct validity, the extent to which our selection tool is actually measuring that construct or concept well. So construct validity can be established using the following. Convergent validity, which is the extent to which scores on a selection tool are associated with scores on measures for other similar concepts. Okay? So you could imagine that if we have a work sample test, for example, that measures actual tasks that someone would do on the job, we would hope that the correlation on work sample scores with work sample scores with future job performance, task performance would be fairly strongly correlated. Now, discriminant validity, this refers to extent to which scores on a selection tool are not associated with scores on measures for other dissimilar concepts. So with that same work sample that's meant to measure actual tasks that someone would be performing on the job, we would expect then that this shouldn't correlate highly with, let's say, something that's completely unrelated to how someone would perform on that task, which maybe it's a research and development type work that this is the type of job. And so therefore, we wouldn't necessarily expect that maybe extroversion would be strongly correlated with scores on that work sample. And so we would expect to see discriminant validity in that sense. So again, construct validity can be established using convergent validity and discriminant validity, and it really can be built upon, and the case for construct validity builds upon content validity and criterion-related validity as well. So in other words, construct validity can be thought of as an overarching type of validity that it subsumes other forms of validity such as content validity and criterion-related validity, which I just mentioned. So now let's move from talking about validity. Before that, we talked about reliability. And before that, we talked about law and ethics as different ways in which we can evaluate the effectiveness, appropriateness, and quality of our selection tools. Let's finish up by talking about utility. So utility can be thought of as the monetary value of a selection tool. So utility can be described generally as the expected benefits relative to the expected cost of using that selection tool. So there's different ways to increase the utility of a selection tool, and these are some prime examples here. First, to increase the utility of a selection tool or the monetary value of a selection tool, you want to use a selection tool that demonstrates high validity. You want to make sure that it's measuring accurately whatever you are trying to measure, because presumably what you're measuring accurately should be job related if it was the conceptual job domain was identified using an up-to-date rigorous job analysis. So again, high validity tends to increase the likelihood that we're going to have higher utility. Another way that we can increase the utility of a selection tool is to reduce the selection ratio or rate. So a selection ratio or selection rate refers to the number of job vacancies relative to the number of applicants. In other words, it's the number of people you're going to hire relative to the total number of applicants you have. And you can decrease the selection ratio. So you can think of a ratio having a numerator and a denominator. You can decrease the selection ratio or rate by increasing the number of applicants, which would mean that we're increasing the size of our denominator. Okay? And so in other words, you're making it essentially more difficult. You're having more competition, in other words, by having more applicants. And hopefully you're going to be getting better and a more representative sample of people with the more applicants you have. And so by reducing the selection ratio or rate, we can hopefully increase the utility of our selection tool, which again refers to the monetary value or economic or financial value of our selection tool. The third way, and this is not the third and final way, but just another way in which we can increase the utility of a selection tool, is to choose a less costly selection tool or to find ways to reduce the cost of a selection tool already in use. So even if a selection tool demonstrates high validity, and even if we reduce the selection ratio or rate, it could still be that our selection tool is so expensive to use and administer, maybe both in terms of time, resources, and just total monetary or financial resources, that it just does not make sense to use that selection tool. Even if it does a really nice job of predicting future job performance, accurately, or whatever the criterion is of interest. Okay? Because remember, again, as I mentioned up here, utility can just be described generally as the expected benefits relative to the expected cost. Okay? So we need to think about the cost of using the selection tool as well. And so ideally, we should try to find selection tools that have the highest level of validity with the lowest level of cost associated with them. So in this presentation, we focused on how we go about evaluating selection tools in terms of their appropriateness, quality, and effectiveness. So we started with an overview where we identified that the ways in which we can go about evaluating the appropriateness, effectiveness, and quality of selection tools is to evaluate whether or not they abide by prevailing law and ethics, as well as the extent to which they demonstrate high levels of reliability, validity, and utility. Now, with law and ethics in particular, it's important to remember that when we're talking about appropriateness here, we're also talking about whether or not the selection tool is biased or demonstrates unfairness. And obviously, we would like to strive for those selection tools and make sure our selection tools are free of bias as much as possible and demonstrate fairness across different protected groups and different classes, especially when we're operating within the United States as a U.S. employer. So these are the references that you might have seen mentioned or cited throughout the presentation. And so if you'd like to take a closer look at what these sources are, they're pictured here. And to reiterate, this lecture was on how we go about evaluating selection tools in terms of their appropriateness, quality, and effectiveness. And this wraps up the lecture.